Hey Young Turks, I'm Nomi Konst. We are here in New York City at the Gotham Gazette, the offices of the Gotham Gazette, to have a conversation about the IDC, a story we've been working on for several weeks now. We have the executive editor of the Gotham Gazette, Ben Max, here, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the formation, the structure of the Independent Democratic Conference, the group of 8 rogue Democrats who have formed their own conference in the state Senate. Thanks, Ben, for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we've been following the IDC for a while, and of course there are now 8 members of this Democratic Conference, Independent Democratic Conference, who've left their own conference. They've responded by saying without their positions and without their place in the Senate, this unique place, there would be a lack of progressive legislation on the table. And we just witnessed a very long, exhausting budget process, which is not complete in New York State. Was dramatic, but there was a member of the IDC, the leader of the IDC, was at the table talking about the budget. Can you describe what's happening right now in New York in terms of the budget?
Sure. So there's basically usually 3 main players in the budget, the governor and the 2 legislative leaders of the majorities. But Jeff Klein, the leader of the IDC, has worked his way in there because the IDC 8-member group, or however many members it has worked in a coalition government with the Senate GOP to create this bolstered majority. The Senate GOP in the New York State Senate has a majority on its own, but it's very slim. It's basically 1 seat in the 63-seat Senate. And so they're willing to bring Jeff Klein into the room and bring the IDC priorities into the room because it helps them in case of an indictment, which we know happen often in Albany.
What do you mean by that?
If there's a lawmaker who gets in trouble with the law, as often happens in our state government, if somebody gets in trouble with the law and is convicted and has to step down, then your 1-seat majority is gone, right?
Got it. Okay.
So they're bolstering their majority. The Senate GOP is saying to the IDC, we'll take your numbers, we'll bring you in, and we'll give you some voice in this process. And in exchange, you in our rules, in the Senate governing rules, you're part of this coalition government. And the IDC is saying, well, mainline Democrats don't have enough for a majority on their own. We have this group that has our own sort of priorities, and we're about functionality, and we're about making things work. And the Democrats the mainline Democrats haven't been very good at that when they've had the chance to lead, even though Jeff Klein was sort of part of that mess in 2009, 2010. And so we're going to influence the Senate GOP and pull the Senate GOP to the left. And that's their argument for saying we can make progress from a Democratic viewpoint, and the Senate GOP is saying, yeah, you can come in the room because you're helping bolster this very thin majority that we have. And it might not even have to be an indictment that the Senate GOP loses their majorities. It could be a sick member, it could be some sort of accident, there could be tragic circumstances.
They just lost, there's a special election right now.
Exactly. Somebody decides, exactly. Somebody decides to run for, town supervisor or city council or whatever it is, and then they leave the chamber. There goes your majority. So for both sides, it makes some sense. Although, of course, from the Democratic side, as you and your viewers know, there's a lot of angst about what are these rogue Democrats doing in a coalition government with Republicans.
So let's look at it from the perspective of the mainline Democrats. This is the Democratic majority, or the group of Democrats that would be the majority, they argue, that are independent from the IDC. What's their perspective on Klein's role, as you mentioned, in the Democratic Party, in the Senate Dems, and really their perception of whether or not legislation will be passed if the IDC join the Democrats again? So
the mainline Democrats don't have a majority even if the IDC were to come back. They would need Simcha Felder, who's elected as a Democrat but has caucused with Republicans for several years. They would need him as well. And so the IDC, as you well know, often says, it's not about us, it's about Simcha Felder, right? You got to, mainline Democrats, get your other Democrat in line. We're still Democrats. He's the one that caucuses with Republicans. And they try to stress, we're our own conference. Yes, we have this coalition agreement, but it lets us put our priorities on the table. The mainline Democrats see the IDC basically as traitors for the most part, right? And very opportunistic. And that's the big label for Jeff Klein for a really long time, right? Is that he created the IDC as an opportunistic move to give himself power. And in part, he's been able to put some priorities on the table and accomplish some things that he's proud of. He gets more attention to his district. His members get committee chairships, et cetera, et cetera. But to many on the mainline Democratic side, he is a traitor of sorts, and he's all about accruing his own power. And there's a theory, of course, that he would come back to the mainline Democrats if he would be elected the minority or majority leader in that case, and basically bump Andrea Stewart Cousins out of that slot. And of course, a lot of people have a problem with that as a bargaining chip.
And his experience leading the Democrats is not the best.
No, there was a lot of dysfunction in Albany around the 2009, 2010, when the Democrats last had a very brief hold, and there was a coup in the chamber, and these rogue Democrats split off to, again, as an opportunistic, sort of cynical power play. So there's been a lot of drama in the Senate over the years. Jeff Klein's been at the center of some of it, and he's now at the center of much of it in Albany. Then of course there's Governor Cuomo, right, who is also a Democrat, and doesn't seem to mind the IDC, right? He sort of pushes that off back on legislative Democrats and Democrats around the state, and basically says, sort of get your house in order. If you, want to then have whatever majority, come with me and I'll work with you. But he likes to build his brand on, I can work with Democrats, I can work with Republicans, and, I'm about getting things done.
The IDC is not its own party. It's still, these members, as we mentioned, still run as Democrats in Democratic districts with the line, D next to their names, not independents. But they've been recently linked to this other party, not to confuse anybody even more,
right.
The Independence Party. I'm assuming that they're not receiving money from the Democratic Party, the Senate Dems, to get reelected, so they had to find some sort of funding sources. Can we talk about just how they're structured and the finances of it?
So New York is complicated, and there's all this party structure. Again, the IDC is a conference. It's not a party. You said it well, worth repeating. There is an independence party in New York. And there are, I don't know how many, but it's not a small number, of New Yorkers who are registered with the Independence Party because they think it makes them an independent. What they really want to be is unaffiliated. But many have signed up and registered to vote as part of the Independence Party, which gives the Independence Party has a ballot line, some infrastructure, although there's been some really good recent exposés, I believe, in the Times-Union in Albany about how the Independence Party and the state Republican Party are very tied together, often cross-endorsed, and you can be on multiple ballot lines in New York and all of that. So, in order to establish their own sort of party campaign committee, which they couldn't do because they're not a party, the IDC entered into an arrangement now with the Independence Party. So they have this coalition government arrangement with the Senate GOP. Now they have a campaign fundraising operation tied to the Independence Party, where basically within the Independence Party apparatus, they have their own campaign committee and their own housekeeping account.
What does that mean?
These are two separate accounts. In New York, political parties are allowed to have quote-unquote housekeeping accounts in order to basically run party business. And there's a lot of questions about whether these IDC accounts are even legal, but who's going to challenge them? I mean, that's been one of the big questions, and part of the reason that mainline Democrats don't challenge them is because they still have this hope of reconciliation. So
really, after the budget process?
This budget process, I mean, you could say, you could give 5 different examples. The budget process, a number of things that have happened over the last 7, 8, 9 years. In 2014, remember, mainline Democrats, including Mayor Bill de Blasio, as part of this, tried to unseat IDC members, including Jeff Klein. They tried to run former city council member Oliver Coppell against him, and there were other challenges to IDC members, including Tony Avella in Queens. John Liu ran against him in 2014 for Senate and also lost. And the mayor was trying to swing the Senate for Democrats. Meanwhile, that sort of fell apart around the Working Families Party endorsement of Governor Cuomo and some other things in there that Mayor de Blasio
Cuomo ran against
Zephyr Teachout. Right. And maybe if you had Mayor de Blasio on some truth serum, he would go back and say that was all handled wrong and he'd do things differently. But of course, we can't go back in time. He can't go back in time and do that. But the IDC has now raised quite a bit of money through these accounts, which again may or may not be legal, and use a lot of that money through the Independence Party and their own campaign committee or their housekeeping account to support Marisol Alcantara, who's one of the two new members, and Jesse Hamilton, who's the other new member. So they've developed now this very interesting, complicated infrastructure. They've added members, and they're sort of here to stay, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I think as we know from Senator Klein and the IDC, they're always one deal away from who knows what, right? There's always, those machinations going on. So we don't know where that's going to head, but the fact that they have these committees open, the fact that they're raising a lot of money, a lot of that comes from real estate, charter school education reform folks giving a lot of money to the IDC, because if the Senate Republicans remain in power, that's more favorable for the education reform movement in New York for sure. So a lot of the money coming from those two sectors, and now they have this pretty strong infrastructure and 8 members, which is a lot in a 63-member chamber.